Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes. We are reading London Belongs to Me, and welcome along on the Tuesday, is it Wednesday in actual fact, the 7th of April 2021. It's 4 o'clock here now, and we will crack on with this rather remarkable book. Hello to our viewers, of course, to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Anne H, to Dave Evad, Justine Jones, Michael White, Zom Coco, Sensible Paul, Sean James Cameron, Jen Colley, I haven't already said that, so hello to you, and Billabong O'Neill, and anybody else who happens to be coming along at all. Settle down, today's performance is starting. Indeed it is. So we are virtually halfway, maybe just under, on this rather exciting book. It's sort of hotting up now with Percy in prison and things going on in the saga of Dulcimer Street. Lee Lawson has just arrived. Hello, I'm here, but expecting a phone call at 4. I'll wait and see. Right, so we'll crack on, I think, and just see how we go. Let me just adjust my volume a little bit. It might be a bit hot. There we go. Right, so who are we talking about here? She. Who's the she? I'm just going back to... who are we talking about? Oh, yes, Mrs. Josser is on her way, I think, talking about Trocadero, wasn't it? She's gone shopping. That's right. She's gone shopping for a new dress. Don't forget to give a thumbs up. Thank you very much. Because she wanted to do things properly, this is Mrs. Josser, I believe, she took the bus straight away to Oxford Street. There were other shops south of the river that would have done quite well. Brixton, Clapham, for instance, were full of smart, select dress shops called Yvonne and Sybil St. Clair and that sort of thing. Nothing really changes, does it? Today, Mrs. Josser wanted to be sure of a real West End cut. Sometimes the little shops skimped you under the arms, or they tried to get away with a false hem if the stuff had been running a bit short. She was taking no risks and went straight to Bourne and Hollingsworth's. So long as she could remember, she had always gone to Bourne's when she wanted something that was good. The only reason why she wasn't better dressed was she didn't go there often enough. Even at Bourne's, it wasn't easy. There was such a selection. The assistant unhooked a likely half dozen, and then, when Mrs. Josser was still undecided, went back for more. The little alcove of mirrors in the fitting room revealed Mrs. Josser in a variety of guises, as a very elderly schoolgirl, or a young matron, or as a rather skittish dowager. In the end, Mrs. Josser decided on the first one that the assistant had shown her. It was a simple, little blue two-piece, and could be in two styles, one with a winter ornament on the left bosom, and one with a red. Mrs. Josser tried on both, and came down on the side of the white one. Then, because the dress was only 3 guineas, she had bought £5 with her, she decided that she would have a look at hats. She hadn't even made up her mind yet that she was going to buy a hat, and she sidled warily to the hat department, like an enemy, avoiding the eyes of the assistants and trying to look as though she were a woman who had a whole cupboard full of hats. Right up to the moment of going over to the 10 and 6penny counter, she and Bourne and Hollingworth were of no use to each other. Bourne and Hollingsworth were trying to sell hats, and she was trying to resist. And she would probably have succeeded if, purely to see what the thing looked like, she hadn't furtively slipped one of the half-guinea models on her head for a moment. As it happened, it was perfectly dreadful. It gave her a sallow sideways appearance, and she snatched it off again. But by now, the young lady in charge of the 10 and 6penny counter had turned up and offered to help her. Then she was really trapped. She couldn't admit that she didn't want to buy a hat because the young lady had just seen her trying one on. It would seem almost like ringing a doorbell and running away again. And she couldn't say that there wasn't one that suited her, because of the enormous counter there was obviously hats that could suit anyone. Could suit anyone. Where have I lost my space? Moreover, once she was actually there with the smell of the felt in her nostrils, she wasn't by any means so sure she didn't want one. In the end, it was the 19th, a hat remarkably like her old one that she bought. It was in hard black felt with the brim turned up at the front and a sort of buckle, also black, set flush in line with the ribbon. And that, she told herself, would be all. She had gathered up her 2 parcels and set off for the door, pleased and self-confident, when the idea of gloves crossed her mind. This time the struggle was more brief. She went straight back to have a look at them. And there was her size, right on the top, waiting for her. They cost 4 and 11 and were guaranteed real kid. All the same, it gave her a little pang as she paid for them. During the past hour she'd been flinging money away. She now had only £1 note and a handful of small change left. Altogether, by the time they were all gathered round the ceremonial spot, the evening of tribal customs looked as though it would have cost them a nice packet. Mr. Josser had been feeling a bit self-conscious about his visit to the prison, but when the time came, it passed off all right. It was only when he got nearer to the prison that it was rather embarrassing, and that wasn't because he was the only one going there. On the contrary, a whole streetful were full of quietly dressed men and women mostly, going in the same direction. There must have been 20 or 30 of them, all planning to arrive punctually at 2 o'clock when the gates opened, and the sight of them gave Mr. Josser a pained, sad feeling again. He took another glance at his companions. They were an extraordinary, respectable-looking and mouse-like crowd. Somehow he would have expected them to look different, if he had expected them at all. It seemed impossible that these sedate, quiet-looking folks should be the wives, mothers, daughters, and intimates of burglars, coiners, gangsters, murderers even. Then a taxi with 2 men in black Homburgs and a woman in a fur coat passed him and drew up outside the prison. The woman had a veil over her hat and drew it down as she got out. They weren't at all mouse-like, these visitors. They must be the belonging of someone important, someone who had side-slipped in the city or run amok in Mayfair. There were still a few minutes to go, and the visitors lined themselves up in a rough queue, avoiding each other's eyes. Mr. Josser took a sideways look at them and noticed something else extraordinary about them. They were all in black. It was like an outing of widows and mourners. Then he glanced down at his own legs. He had put his best suit on, and he was all in black too. It was evidently a very efficient run sort of prison, because punctually at the hour the door opened. But it was a slow business getting in. There was a policeman standing at the gate and 2 warders in flat caps. They scrutinised everyone as though they didn't like the look of them, and there was a veiled suggestion about their attitude, colder and more sullen somehow than that of policemen on point duty, that if there were any attempt to rush the gate, they would open fire. In consequence, there was no pushing or jostling. The mourners, or visitors, or whatever they were, filed in slowly and silently. Then they arrived at a door. It was a good thick door studded with nails. Mr. Josser was still thinking about the thickness of the door when the policeman touched him on the shoulder and pointed down at the bag. "Open up," he said briefly. It had been an innocent little caseful when it was packed, but under the policeman's eyes everything assumed a sudden guiltiness. The Gladstone bag might have been full of skeleton keys and dynamite from the way the policeman went through it. He turned over the 2 clean shirts and the pair of underpants, fingering the seams as though to make sure there wasn't any files or lock saws concealed in them. And then he came upon the packet of cigarettes that Mr. Josser had bought. "Any matches?" he asked. Mr. Josser shook his head. He saw now how silly it was of him to have forgotten matches. You could hardly expect a prison to provide little things like that. "You'll have to hand these over," the policeman said. "No tobacco allowed inside the prison without a permit." "Oh, I'm sorry," Mr. Josser replied. I didn't mean any harm by it." He was suddenly afraid that his action might have compromised Percy in some way. But the policeman, being treated with respect, became temporarily quite jovial. "You haven't done any yet," he said. When the cigarettes had been handed over, Mr. Josser was directed into a waiting room. It was a long, cold apartment with a dark green dado waist-high running round it, and 3 small windows set almost flush in the ceiling. Mr. Josser noticed, with a slight sinking of the heart, that the windows were barred, although even visitors tried to escape sometimes. At either end of the room, an electric light bulb in a plain china reflector was burning. The lamps were low-powered, and you could look at them without blinking. 2 wooden benches down either wall comprised the furnishings. Altogether, it was rather like a waiting room in a railway station that had given up expecting any trains. The whole place smelt strongly of carbolic. It had a clean rather than a friendly smell, carbolic, and it may have been carbolic, or the iciness of the air, or the barred windows, or the rattling of keys somewhere in the corridor, or the combination of all of them together that made Mr. Josser shudder. Whatever it was, he became uncomfortably aware of a new and overpowering quality about the room that swamped all the others, a unique and distinctive quality: oppressiveness. To his immense surprise, after only about 5 minutes of prison life, Mr. Josser found himself looking forward to getting outside again. The efficiency that he had noticed earlier at the gate was discernible inside as well. It might have been an outpatients department in one of the big hospitals that he was watching. The patients were called in a very strict arranged rota. When the warder was ready for them, he came inside and called out, "Waiting for 13796 or 27345 or whatever the number might be." Most of the visitors simply went along to the special visitors' room where they saw their loved ones through the screen of rabbit wire. Mr. Josser, however, was taken right along to the cell because Percy wasn't a convicted criminal yet. He was still Percy Boone, Esquire, a British citizen with all his rights. There wasn't anything actually against him yet. It was simply that there were certain doubts. It was quite a distance from the waiting room. The smell of carbolic persisted, and the way led down the corridor, an endlessly long stone corridor it seemed, past the doors of cells from which Mr. Josser, feeling averted... let me read that again. The smell of carbolic persisted, and the way led down a long stone corridor, an endlessly long corridor it seemed, past the doors of cells from which Mr. Josser feelingly averted his eyes in passing. The waiting room was something free and open to the outside world, compared with this stone corridor. Here was the very heart of the prison itself, and the weight of the surrounding stone had bored down on it, crushing and flattening. Then the corridor opened. Another door, another unlocking, into a wide hall that was arranged like the inside of a gigantic pigeon loft. There were 3 tiers of the pigeon boxes all round the sides, and in between the tiers sheets of wire netting were slung. There were no shortcuts that way. Mr. Josser paused and looked upwards. The roof was arched in a high V and had windows let into it, but the glass that they were made of was thick and yellow. And there was another piece of the same wire mesh spread across them. In the result, the light came through strained and pallid. It made the whole place seem as though a cold, wet mist were filling in. But they were there now. They'd reached Percy's private bedroom. But they were there now. They'd reached Percy's private bed-sitting room in this enormous block. The warder selected an outsized key and thrust it into the outsized keyhole. Why don't they use Yale's? Mr. Josser found himself wondering. They're safe enough, aren't they? And opened the door. But the warder didn't give him much time for stray thoughts. In you go, he said. It wasn't an easy interview. Percy seemed pleased enough to see Mr. Josser, but he was preoccupied and restless, and the boy didn't look well. Mr. Josser thought. He'd had a haircut in the prison, and the barber had made a strictly regulation job of it. It was short at the back and sides and on the top as well, with a broad fringe left in front for parting. The barber, who had been on this work for years, had only 2 styles up his sleeve. There was Percy's kind and the other kind. The other kind for the men actually under sentence. They didn't have any fringe. Because his hair was cropped, the lines on Percy's face stood out all the more strongly, and somehow they weren't young lines any longer. The skin across the cheeks were drawn tight, and the skin under the eyes had dropped into little pouches. If Mr. Josser hadn't known where he was, he would have said that Percy had been giving himself a few late nights. I bought you some cigarettes, but they kept them downstairs, he said, by way of an opening. Percy gave a kind of self-conscious grin. That's all right, he said. 10 a day, doctor's orders. Well, I'm glad they're looking after them for you. It was Mr. Josser's turn to give a self-conscious grin. How's Mum? Percy asked. Fine, Mr. Josser told him. Just a bit run down. She's got a rest, that's all. Is she asking after me? All the time, Percy, boy, all the time. There was a pause. Anyone else asking? Mr. Josser considered. They're all asking, he explained. All of them wanted to be remembered to you. Another pause. Who's all? Percy asked. Mr. Josser considered again. Well, there's Mrs. Josser, he said. She's always asking. Anybody else? Oh, yes, Mr. Josser answered. There's Connie and Mr. Puddy. They both ask. Why doesn't Mum write? They won't let her. I told you, she's got a rest. It isn't like Mum not to write. She isn't bad, is she? Oh, no, she's not bad, Mr. Josser said hurriedly. Just got to take things easy. The last time Mum wrote, the sister wrote for her, Percy observed. It was in a flat, detached sort of voice that he said it, as though he wasn't talking to Mr. Josser directly. It was rather as though he wasn't talking to anyone in particular, just stating a personal grievance. Any of the others ask? He said at length. Well, there's Mr. Squales, he does, and Mrs. Vizard, of course. She's always asking. It isn't Mum's hands, is it? Mr. Josser pulled himself up. He'd been intending to mention Mrs. Vizard's engagement. All the way up in the train he thought that Percy would like to hear about it, but The boy didn't seem interested in anything ordinary like that anymore. Oh no, her hands are all right, he said. It's simply that she's lying down. Hello, Bill. Sorry, my son Billy is right. I'm just doing my reading show. Sorry. That's all right. I put the spirit level on the box upstairs in the room. Thank you. If you want the drill, I've got it in here. You'll have to wait. Fine. Sorry about that. Anyway, we resume. It's all interruptions on this show. No, her hands are all right. It's simply that she's lying down. Any of the chaps at the garage ever ask? This stumped Mr. Josser. I don't rightly know, he said. I don't come across 'em. I guess they ask all right. Then he thought of something else. Doris asks, he went on. She came back to Dulcimer Street now. This piece of information seemed to annoy Percy. What'll she do that for? He asked. She's come home to get married, Mr. Josser said. And as soon as he said it, he was sorry. It seemed callous to talk about getting married to a man who was in Percy's position, and he was right. Percy didn't answer. I've left you some clean clothes, Mr. Josser said at length. If there's anything special you want, you've only got to let me know. Percy sucked in his cheeks and thought. I'd like some more papers, he said. I don't see any papers here, not new ones at least. Anything in 'em? Mr. Josser thought for a moment. You've seen about the pact? He asked. Percy shook his head. The Nazis and the Bolsheviks have signed a non-aggression pact. At least it isn't signed yet, but it's just been announced. Mr. Josser paused. He'd forgotten about Percy for the moment and was wondering how he was going to explain that one at the next sitting. He couldn't help looking as though he, as Foreign Secretary, had let things slip pretty badly. It's pretty serious, he went on. There isn't anything to stop Germany. But Percy wasn't listening. I don't mean that sort of thing, he said. I meant anything about me. Mr. Josser forgot all about the hairdresser until he was nearly home. And because it was late already, he couldn't risk the extra journey on to the Oval. There was nothing for it, therefore, but to go across the way to Epsom. It was clearly a mistake because he wasn't one of the regulars, and they didn't know him, and he didn't know them. Or perhaps he didn't make himself quite clear. Or perhaps it was an inexperienced assistant. Or perhaps it was just Epsom's way of turning out a haircut. Whatever it was, they pretty much near cropped him. He might have been Percy. Before Mr. Josser stopped the man, he had run those galloping electric clippers all round the back and sides, and then he'd settled down with a grim determination sort of fashion to level off what remained. Even the little quiff of hair in front disappeared. 10 minutes after he'd gone into Epsom's, Mr. Josser emerged looking like a choir boy. He was so alarmed, indeed, by his appearance that he wouldn't let the barber do anything about his moustache. His own man on the other side of the street would have known exactly what to do. 3 quick clips and it would have been finished. But here, heaven knows what might have happened. He might have found himself with a Charlie Chaplin or a Ronald Coleman or anything. Because he couldn't get it attended to properly, it would have been better if he simply had left the thing altogether. But when he came to have a look at himself in the big mirror of the dressing table, he didn't like doing that because the rest of his hair was so short. He was like an almost bald man with a great ragged moustache hanging down the front. After regarding it carefully from all sides, he took out a pair of Mrs. Josser's cutting-out scissors from the drawer and began making a few cautious snips. It was probable, because the scissors were so large, that he took off more than he intended on the first operation. He was so busy with the part of the blade that he was looking at that he didn't notice what the point was doing. And taking the thing as a whole, it wasn't a straight cut either. It made the entire face look lopsided. After that, there was nothing for it but to cut the other side level, and this made the moustache look too shallow for its width. After studying it carefully again for a few minutes, he decided to bring in the sides a bit. By the time he had finished, it was very tidy, but it was also a very small moustache. It was like a white moth resting there on his upper lip. Oh my goodness. Chapter 40. Slurp of drink. Just bear with me one second. Everything all right there, Bill? You all right, Bill? You all right, Bill? Oh, good. Just checking. Sorry about that. I was just chatting to my son. But I turned the volume down so it didn't disturb you. Chapter 40. As it turned out, they were very early. Very early. It was only about 20 minutes to 7 when they arrived at the Trocadero. Mr. Josser was for killing time by going round the block once or twice, but Mrs. Josser insisted on going straight in. It was her shoes that were troubling her again. There were plenty of people about, of course. There were at least a dozen other diners who'd turned up about 6:30 for 7. And because all the others had ordered themselves a drink, Mr. Josser did the same. When he asked Mrs. Josser what she would like to have, however, the offer caught her at a disadvantage. She was unfamiliar with every one of the cocktails on the list in front of her, and in the end, when Mr. Josser decided to have a pink gin, Mrs. Josser said that she would have one too. Mr. Josser's familiarity with pink gin rather surprised her. It was a side to his character that she had not known before. But in comparison with the change in his appearance, this new revelation was nothing. She could still not look at him without being surprised. It was like having a stranger who, in certain lights, looked oddly like her husband. I'm sorry, I was just imagining him with his new haircut and his terribly little white moth perched under his nose. She still couldn't look at him without being surprised. It was like having a stranger who, in certain lights, looked oddly like her husband sitting there beside her. And he had a more than usually far away look in his eyes. That was because he kept remembering about Percy. He just couldn't help it. Mrs. Josser, however, had more than Mr. Josser to look at. She was doing what they described to herself as keeping her eyes skinned for the Davenports. Some psychic sense told her, though she had never seen them, that she would recognise them at once. And indeed, she recognised them several times in quick succession. There was a large man in a black coat and striped trousers, very obviously a doctor, accompanied by several ropes of pearls, with a thin, pale lady inside them. There was a broad, ruddy-faced countryman with a jolly, closely shingled woman in a rough tweed costume, just the sort of thing the wife of a rural medical man might wear. There was a tall, melancholy man in dark grey, clearly a specialist who made his living by keeping people off red meat and spirits, and a shrivelled little woman who might have been under the treatment for years. It was all very exciting and very disconcerting as the imaginary Davenports, one after another, passed before her. Then, when she was least expecting it, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Through the swing doors in front of her, a woman came in wearing new-looking blue dress with white ornament on the left bosom. God. A man might have seen it and experienced no concern. Mr. Josser did, in fact, glance at the woman and then glance away again. But for Mrs. Josser, it was a disaster. It ruined everything. It ruined everything. She felt as though instead of being nicely dressed for the evening, she were in a kind of 3-guinea uniform. The price ticket might as well be sticking to her. The other dress was identical. Mrs. Josser was still hoping that the woman would eventually be given a seat on the far side of the restaurant when Bill and Doris came in. They had picked each other up somewhere on the way, and they were wearing the idiotically happy expression that they habitually wore when they were together. It might have been some private, unexplainable joke that they were sharing. Bill came straight over to Mrs. Josser and kissed her. They were still in the early stages of kissing, and they were awkward about it. Mrs. Josser put her cheek up as though she were avoiding him. Then Doris kissed her father, and everything began to begin. "We'd better order a drink," Bill said. "I'll bet my people will be late." "Not for me, thank you," Mrs. Josser said firmly. "I've just had one. Fred can have another one if he likes." But Bill wouldn't listen to her. He ordered white ladies all round, and because they had actually been paid for before Mrs. Josser realised what was happening, of course, she had to drink hers. She liked it better than the pink gin. She was still sipping it when the identical dress entered the lounge again. Mrs. Josser was feeling better after the white lady. She merely averted her eyes and waited for the woman to go away. But the woman didn't go away. She stood surveying the circle of faces and then came straight over to them. "Oh, there you are, Billy," she said. "I told father I was sure we were waiting in the wrong place. He's through there by the door." As soon as he had introduced his mother to everybody, he noticed, without having any idea why, that they seemed to be staring rather hard at Mrs. Josser, and then he went off in search of his father. He returned a moment later with a diminutive, white-haired man in a neat blue suit with a Masonic emblem dangling from a watch chain. The newcomer had evidently spruced himself up specially for the occasion. His hair, recently cut short, was brushed out flat on the top of his head. There was no difficulty about the conversation at first because they all had to admire Doris's ring. It was a small single diamond set in a thin band of platinum, and the novelty of the design quite overcame them. They passed Doris's hand round and round the table to examine it. Then, as Bill had ordered 2 more white ladies for his people, and Mrs. Davenport had nibbled a few of the salted almonds in the little dish in front of them, they all passed through into the restaurant. The conversation by now was not easy. They couldn't go on talking about Doris's ring forever, and apparently there was nothing else that even mildly interested them. Mrs. Davenport was a quiet, faded woman who left most of her sentences unfinished, and Dr. Davenport had a habit of referring to everything to her in a way that made other people seem superfluous. As soon as they were settled, he beamed across at his wife. The Jossers could see now that he at once was the beaming kind, and addressed her. "We don't often dine out nowadays, do we, Mother?" he said. Mrs. Davenport shook her head. "No, dear, it must be nearly... I expect you're used to it," Mr. Davenport went on, turning the beam in Mrs. Josser's direction. "That's because you live in London. We're just country mice, aren't we, Mother?" The waiter, like the younger son of an Italian count, hung over them, and they ordered what he told them to. Then the wine waiter, like the count himself, came along, and Mr. Davenport got out his glasses. He was evidently a man who understood the subject because he went right through the wine list, from the champagnes on the first page, through the Hocks and Moselles, to the clarets and burgundies, and only looked up when he came to the liqueurs at the back. But the result, after all, was disappointing. What would everybody like?" he asked, as though they'd all been reading the list over his shoulder while he was holding it. When nobody spoke, Dr. Davenport passed the wine list over to Mr. Josser. "Here he said. You take it. I expect it's more in your line than mine. We aren't great wine drinkers, are we, Mother? They took so long in deciding that the wine waiter went away and then came back again. But Mr. Josser hadn't been wasting his time. He'd been thinking busily, and he had cause to. He just remembered that he'd only got £2 on him, and it hadn't definitely been decided who was going to pay for the dinner. It sounded like the Davenports' party in the invitation, but Mr. Josser started ordering things. But if Mr. Josser started ordering things now, how was he to know that the waiter wouldn't give him the bill at the end? So he decided on how do you pronounce that? Moselle, is it? Mosel? Is that a wine? Mosel? He decided on a Mosel to be on the safe side. Everyone always liked Mosel. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And it was only 8 o'clock, and it was only 8 and 6 a bottle. He pointed at it victoriously. Number 86. But no, number 86, the wine waiter said meaningly. 1 bottle? Mr. Josser nodded. 1 bottle, he said. And the words Dr. Davenport looked up sharply. Better ask him to make it 2, he said. This is a celebration, remember? Even though it was evidently meant nicely, Mr. Josser didn't altogether like the sound of what Mr. Davenport had just said. It still left the question of payment in abeyance. From the way Bill's father had put it, it might have been either a generous invitation or a kind of nagging reminder not to stint people who had come halfway across England for their dinner. Mr. Josser became frightened again. But Dr. Davenport was happy enough. He'd taken charge of things with an easy professional heartiness. He was rubbing his hands together. Well, well, he said, we want to get to know our new friends, don't we, Mother? And I expect that they'll want to get to know us. Do you live right across the centre of town, Mrs. Josser? Mrs. Josser drew in her lips. Just a bus ride, she said. Kennington. Oh, I used to know Kennington when I was a young man, Dr. Davenport went on. Had a friend there. Used to walk over to him. Oh, sorry. Used to know Kensington. Is it? No, it isn't Kensington. It's Kennington, Mr. Josser told him. Dr. Davenport seemed surprised. Oh, I would have sworn it was Kensington, he said. I used to go there quite often. Through the park, you know. He's a surgeon now. They're different places. Mrs. Davenport interrupted. Kensington's over by Harrods, and Kennington is the other place your friend used to live. But Dr. Davenport was drinking his soup hastily because the waiter was hanging about again. Well, it's a small point, isn't it? He asked. Everybody can't live in the same place. We're all here together, and that's the great thing, isn't it, Mother? He leant over and patted Doris's hand. I'm sure we're all going to be great friends, he said. Bill's a very lucky man, I can see that. There was a pause for a moment, because it was really Bill's turn to say something. But he couldn't help because he was sulking. Ever since he and Doris had become engaged, he'd been trying to avoid this dinner party, but his mother and father had insisted. At the moment he was sitting there, eating gloomily. Then there was a movement from the other end of the table. Mrs. Davenport was trying to say something. She was making those little signalling motions, slight raisings of the eyebrows and wordless lip movements, with which partners, long married, seem to address each other as though by some prearranged code. And as soon as Dr. Davenport became aware of it, he lost all that easy confidence he had been displaying earlier. He began to dissemble, and instead of looking anybody in the face, he talked down at the tablecloth. Of course, he said, it'll have to be some time. It can't be all at once, you know. No runaway marriage or anything like that. Bill isn't even qualified, remember. Great mistake for a young man to tie himself down before he's properly not got going. May affect his whole career. He paused for a moment, and Bill took hold of Doris's hand under the table and squeezed it. But before Dr. Davenport could say any further, Mrs. Josser had spoken for him. "We're not pressing it," she said. Dr. Davenport looked up. He had entirely understood the remark and thought that Mrs. Josser was on his side and behaving very generously. "There you are, you see," he said. "We're very pleased to have Bill marry the young lady, aren't we, Mother? But just not yet. That's all it is. Just not yet. Say in a year or two." But Mrs. Josser was far from satisfied. How do we know what his prospects will be in a year or two?" she asked. Dr. Davenport was beaming again. "Well, they'll be better than they are now, won't they?" he replied. "That's as maybe," Mrs. Josser said. "But they mayn't be good enough for our Doris." "Oh, Mother, really?" Doris had removed her hand from Bill's and was facing Mrs. Josser across the table. What have I said that I shouldn't?" Mrs. Josser asked her. It was all turning out just as Bill had known it would. He warned Doris as they came what his father would say. He said it already by letter, and his mother had written the same things by the same post. He couldn't let it go any further now. "It isn't as bad as all that," he said. "Plenty of fellows get married as soon as they qualify. It's all a question of what they're going to do." "You were going to do surgery," his father said firmly. "That's another 2 years." "I'll wait," Doris said. For a moment it seemed as though the point had been settled. Dr. Davenport even tried a faint, rather flickering beam on the company. But he was reckoning without Mrs. Josser. As soon as his eye caught hers, the beam died out again. "And what's it going to be like at the end of 2 years, I'd like to know?" she demanded. "He'll only just qualified even then." Bill's a very clever doctor. Bill's a very clever doctor. He's going to make a lot of money. It was Mrs. Davenport who had spoken. Her voice died away halfway through, but even so, it indicated a remarkable change of attitude on her part. From opposing the whole proposal, she was now actually defending it. She appeared to be trying to sell her son, in fact. Her duplicity shocked Dr. Davenport profoundly. Everything that he'd said had been what Mrs. Davenport had told him to say. He felt suddenly isolated and betrayed. Altogether, it was a very awkward moment, and Mrs. Josser did her best to make things easier. "Who's that?" "Mr. Josser." "Oh, he's clever all right," he said. When I had pleurisy, he operated on me a treat." But Mr. Josser wasn't allowed to go any further. Dr. Davenport turned to Bill immediately. "You did what?" he asked in amazement. "Only a paracenthesis," Bill told him. "Only a paracenthesis?" Dr. Davenport repeated. He was obviously shaken. "And what would you have done if anything had gone wrong, may I ask?" "Nothing did go wrong," Bill told him. "But suppose it had. Only suppose it had," Dr. Davenport went on. "Where would you have been then?" "And where would my husband have been?" Mrs. Josser demanded. This time Dr. Davenport ignored her. His professional sense was so deeply shocked that he couldn't think of anything but Bill's crime. "You'd have gone to prison," he said. "That's where you'd have gone." Then Mrs. Davenport joined in the conversation. "You shouldn't have done it, Bill," she said. You ought to have remembered." "Remembered what?" Bill asked her. "Why, all the money your father's been spending on you," she explained. Mrs. Josser raised her head sharply. "Money?" she began, but Mr. Josser stopped her. It's all my fault, really," he insisted. "He could see I was in pain, and I asked him to." "No, you didn't," Doris interrupted. It wasn't either of you. I asked myself, Bill said emphatically. He'd have been dead if I didn't. And you let him do it, knowing he wasn't qualified? Dr. Davenport asked Mr. Josser. I didn't tell them, Bill replied. A thought flashed across Mrs. Josser's mind. Did you know, Doris? She asked. Of course I knew. And you let your young man experiment on your own father? Dr. Davenport sat back for a moment and wiped his forehead. For the time being, the centre of the storm had passed outside his family. It was now a matter for the Jossers. And Mr. Josser tried to save things. He gave a rather nervous smile and pushed his plate away from him. Well, I don't see what the trouble is, he said. It all turned out very nicely, and I'm better, and it gave Bill a bit of practice, and it's all over and done with now. And as he said it, the original Dr. Davenport returned to the table. He was a man of peace himself, and he recognised just such another in Mr. Josser. He began beaming more brightly than ever. That's right, he said. No good crying over spilt milk. I'm sure Bill's learned his lesson. And no harm's been done. Let's all have another glass of wine. He paused. We don't often come up to town for the evening, do we, Mother? But in her present mood, Mrs. Davenport appeared to be quite incapable of contradicting him. She seemed on the point of telling him that they were always coming up on the town. But in her present mood, Mrs. Davenport appeared to be quite capable of contradicting him. She seemed on the point of telling him that they were always coming up to town. She rose from the table and said rather shakily, I'm just going to leave you all for a moment. Mrs. Josser rose simultaneously. I'm coming too, she said. It's strange the way two women seem to be on each other's side now. In a strange way, the two women seemed to be on each other's side now. It was two keen-witted, far-sighting women ranged against two stupid, easy-going men. They left Bill and Doris out of the calculations altogether, and Bill and Doris left them out of theirs. As soon as Mrs. Josser and Mrs. Davenport had gone, Bill got up and took Doris by the hand. How about a bit of dancing? He asked. Then, when they two had gone, Mr. Davenport looked across at Mr. Josser. They grinned rather sheepishly at each other. What do you say to a cigar? Dr. Davenport asked. A cigar and a spot of brandy. It's my dinner, remember? The party broke up affectionately on the pavement of Shaftesbury Avenue at 11:15. Mrs. Josser and Mrs. Davenport were bosom friends by then, and so too were the two husbands. Between the four of them, they'd all got fixed up. Bill and Doris could go on being engaged. Of course, when they clearly saw... Bill and Doris could go on being engaged, of course. They saw clearly that there was no way of upsetting that, but there would be no talk about getting married until Bill was a doctor. Anything else, it was agreed, wouldn't really be fair to either of the two young people. Phew! That was quite a complex chapter to read. Ooh. We move on to chapter 41, but we move on to chapter 41 tomorrow. Oh, how is it all going? Sorry, I haven't really acknowledged any of your comments. The door needs oil. I'll bring some WD-40. Can't wait to get my hair cut, says Sensible Paul. Buzz cut. Don't think Mrs. is very happy. I enjoyed your video about the allotment. Might do a Vobes cut at some point. Richard could do a demo. Go out. We'll catch up late. Right, brilliant. Okay. Nothing to do with me then. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch up with you tomorrow, which is Thursday. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care. Look after yourselves. Thanks for coming along. I hope that made sense and I didn't mess up too many of the lines. All good fun. The observations, I love just those little human observations. in Norman Collins' work. It's just that's what sort of brings it on out of the page in a way that it is just so funny. Anyway, there we go. That's it. I'll catch up with you tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye for now. Bye-bye.